Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us.
Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins. And we're here to seek to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. One of the most contemporary issues we're facing, it's not just a contemporary issue, it's a long-standing issue, and that's white privilege. And so I've asked a few of my friends who I've partnered with over the last several years to discuss with me this theme. And on my screen, I see from left to right, Cody Whittington, who's a pastor in Montana. And we work together in various contexts. And Cliff Chappell, who's a pastor here in the Portland area, in Portland, Oregon. And Cooky, who's a business leader, city leader of note, from California to Portland, so on and so forth, a leader at New Wine, New Wineskins, as well as others here. Gloria Young, business leader, civic leader in the Bay Area. Also a leader at New Wine, New Wineskins over the years, and then Ross Halbach, who is a business leader and also a leader at New Wine, New Wineskins. These are all friends who drink new wine with me. They've been asking for old wine for some time, but I just keep sticking to the new stuff. So thank you for joining us, friends, for this episode on white privilege today. So without further ado, I'm going to ask each of you to just take a minute or so, as complex as this issue is, to talk about white privilege. Just give your take in 1 minute or so, as hard as it is, to define for people what is white privilege. Who would like to start? Ross, how about you?
Sure. Put me on the spot to begin with. I think most people will go to Peggy McIntosh, who talks about white privilege as an invisible knapsack. And so it's something that gives us access. It's like a passport, a free pass, a blank check that white people, or those who are deemed white, get to access and use at any moment in time. I think what's profound about Peggy McIntosh's idea and how she unpacks it is it gives white people opportunity to walk through step by step all the moments that we get privilege. And really what white privilege is just the flip side of 400 years of disadvantage. If somebody's having disadvantage, somebody's having advantage. And that's what privilege is. But even more profound about McIntosh's analysis is the invisibility of it. I think that's what's key, is that privilege is invisible to me. I'm accessing it all the time, but I don't recognize it. And I think an unveiling of that in recent news was the issue with Christian Cooper bird watching in the Central Park, and a white woman threatening to call the cops on him and then doing so. That unveils privilege, in that it shows that she has a power over him and she knows the threat on his life that doesn't threaten her life in the same way. So that's a quick summary of white privilege for me.
And it's also interesting that you had mentioned the word, or those who are perceived white, right?
Yeah, I think it's
a social construct in many ways.
I like to say deemed white or seen as white. So, a lot of people can be seen as white and might not be white. So.
Yeah, I just finished watching The Last Dance on Michael Jordan, and I think he's someone who may be perceived as white in many contexts. That's just something that came to my mind as you were saying it. We could always debate that, but he's in a sense someone who transcends these issues, and I put transcend in quote marks. Cooky, how about you? What do you see as white privilege today? Your definition. It's on mute.
In addition to what Ross has articulated in terms of, the societal privilege, for me, it's like even taking it okay, so how does that look, on a daily basis? How does that look for me? And I think that one of the things that I see is this notion that knowledge is white, and so what we hear, what we see, who's articulating it, who's navigating the conversation, can really skew which way our thinking goes, whether you're, it starts in childhood, in terms of the books we read, the school textbooks that we have. Knowledge is white, and any kind of a voice that brings a different view, a different life perspective, life story is seen as suspect. Where did you get that? I don't necessarily think that's true. And I think that even like you articulated, Paul, from the beginning, well, you look at even our Constitution and the reality that we, the people, was never meant to mean all the people. And I think, our Navajo brother, Mark Charles, articulates that really well. And I think that white privilege is also, for me, knowledge is white. I can pick and choose what I want to hear, what I don't want to hear, what I want to believe, what I don't want to believe, even to the point of I can choose to turn it off. I can choose to walk away. I can choose to even doubt the stories that are shared as being real. I think it's really important to take even Peggy McIntosh, what is said, but if I don't look at it in myself, that's white privilege. I don't have to, I can just move along.
Yeah, that's such a key point. I don't have to be in the conversation. I can turn off the button at any point, whereas Gloria and Cliff, for example, they live it. They can turn it off, turn it on. It's their life in a way that's indelibly marked, if you will, because of our culture. Thank you, Cooky. Gloria, your thoughts on white privilege, and then we'll go to Cody and then Cliff.
Thank you. For me, growing up, I can recall having a conversation with my mother when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and she said I was quite sharp. And one of the things that I said to her is, when I grow up, I want to have a business, Mom, so that I can take care of you. And what I'm going to do is make sure that a white person runs the business, because I know that if I run it, we won't make money. So that started very young, recognizing the fact that, and I'll use the analogy, if you have a white canvas and a black canvas, you're looking at two different canvases. You probably are going to have more opportunity for dreaming what that canvas could look like, as opposed to if you look at a black canvas. And I think that when I think about that, and I think about white privilege, I think about the fact that it's so critical to have white people come along, black people as advocates, because I think that you have the ability as white privilege, the DNA is there. So you can ignore, you can be silent, you can be in denial, and it's all right. It's acceptable. You don't have to live in the skin of someone that is facing the prejudices in this world each and every day and every moment. I can think of the fact that I went to parochial school, and as a young person in a school where there was only 4 African Americans and everyone else was of Irish and Italian descent, and we were taught by nuns. And even in that environment, we, the 4 children in that school, faced unbearable, prejudices over the years. I'll never forget the extraordinary education I got there, but we definitely faced it, not necessarily from the teachers, but from students and from the activities that took place.
Thank you, Gloria. And just as you were speaking about being a business owner and wanting a white person to run it, it reminded me of what a businesswoman said years ago on Alberta Street in Portland. I used to teach a class on cultural anthropology with a pastor in Portland, Don Frazier, and the African American businesswoman said, a Black person's property has no value until a white person owns it. And she was talking about the gentrification issues on Alberta Street and in North Portland occurring today. And it just reminded me of what you said, reminding me of that. And it's intense, right? I mean, it doesn't matter how far you get up the ladder and whatever, it's there. I mean, Walter Payton, one of America's greatest football heroes, his daughter is an anchor on Fox News, and she was talking about just how she experienced it at Walgreens recently, and she was broken up as she shared about this, the racism that she experienced, and that's Sweetness's daughter in Chicago. And it's intense. It's always there. Thank you, Gloria. Cody, your thoughts on white privilege in your context, how you articulate. We'll come to that in a little bit, but just define for us white privilege.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. I think from my context, I'd like to start with what it's not, and my reasons for this will likely become more apparent and obvious as the conversation continues. But when we're talking about white privilege, we don't seem to be implying that we're not implying that we are racist by default. I don't think that's what we're saying. We're not saying hey, we're racist. Now, you can certainly be a racist, but I don't think it's implying that you are in fact a racist.
You mean like intentionally trying to demean someone, harm someone who's of a different skin color intentionally?
Yeah. And I don't think it's saying that, we didn't work hard to get where we are, to get what we have in life. I don't think that's what we're saying either when we say white privilege. I don't think it's saying that we've necessarily had it easy, that we don't understand hardship, crisis, and things of that nature. I think those are three out of many things that we've got to kind of nuance as we talk about what white privilege is, at least in my context, in order to make any headway. And so the way it's been explained to me and the way I'm understanding it right now is that white privilege is basically the inherent benefits that are generally afforded to me, given through various institutions and structures, whether they be social, cultural, economic, educational, judicial, simply because I am born white in America. And so, yeah, and white being the majority in America. And so, in other words, there's generally natural advantages to being white, and there are certain personal and relational burdens that I don't have to carry, and certain obstacles that I don't have to overcome based on being white. And it's probably an incomplete description, but that's how I'm seeing it, and that's the direction I'm seeing it right now within my own context.
Yes, and you're in a predominantly white context, right, in Montana, diverse ideologically, as I understand it,
Yep.
but very white. And when you talk about these things, and we'll come back to it in a little bit, there's often a wall that people have, and we're talking about white privilege. We're dealing with institutional racism, things of that sort, and that's often lost on white people like me. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes and give opportunities for all of us to engage further on this. So thank you, Cody. Cliff, Pastor Cliff, your thoughts. White privilege.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this conversation and the input that each one of you have shared so far. But when I think of white privilege, what I see is it's like a pass that white people receive at birth into freedom, and the freedom to go where they want to go, to think what they want to think, to do or act the way they want to act, to engage in conversations that they would like to engage in. If they don't feel comfortable, then they can disengage without penalty. But as for a person of color has to earn that pass. And that by earning that pass is not just a carte blanche as a white person, but you have to earn it through education. You have to earn it through real estate. You have to earn it in finances. You have to earn it. Every single phase has to be earned. And then in the process of earning that, there are still restrictions placed upon that pass. And so white privilege gives a person a free pass into the accesses of life, whereas a Black person has to earn that. And oftentimes, if a white decides that you don't get that pass, then a black does not get it. But that white privilege gives a white person the access and the power, really, to either accept or deny.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Pastor. And I think, as people are hearing the various responses to what white privilege is, you see various nuances, various dimensions to it. This is just a very brief introduction to it. There's concern even amongst the panelists. I mean, we only get a minute or so to discuss white privilege, each one of us. I mean, it could take a lifetime. And in fact, it is a lifetime. Yeah. And so this is just introducing the conversation. No doubt those who watch this are going to have all kinds of questions. And we're going to have other opportunities to engage these themes on this subject of white privilege. So many thanks for your thoughts on this subject. Cody, you had shared with us just a little bit ago, and you've shared with me elsewhere how difficult it is to explain white privilege to white people, or at least in your context. Why is that? Specifically, why is that in your context? And how do you try to articulate beyond or further to what you've already said about what it's not? And for people, guys like me, so that we can grapple with it more, not shut off the mind, so to speak, and not put up our walls of defense, because I know that's your concern, is to get beyond walls of defense, to have a real conversation. And you're white like me. So you want to speak to that, Cody?
Yeah, sure. And again, my definitions and descriptions are widely incomplete, and I recognize that, but there are, I guess, there are multiple reasons why it's challenging. Just kind of hone in on two, and the third point would probably be more of an implication of the two things, but at least in my context, I think that's just important to keep in mind, is my context being predominantly white, and in a context where a small church, we got a lot of diversity. We have folks on both sides of the political aisle, and but again, predominantly white. And so I think one of the challenges that we have in having the conversation is the innate over politicization of the actual phrase white privilege. This phrase has been widely politicized in the last few years, and its association and use, it often, just because of the phrase itself, it often sounds like a fighting term that keeps people from wanting to even think about engaging. And I think that provides an obstacle in and of itself because of the circles in which it's predominantly used. And so even the phrase itself, white privilege, for folks in my context, again, it goes back to, well, what are you saying? Are you saying that, one, I'm a racist? Are you saying, two, I didn't earn what I have? It goes back to those misunderstandings, which is the second challenge, is, again, those misunderstandings. I think we misunderstand the concept of white privilege, and this misunderstanding creates a distorted lens where it's harder to see exactly what's taking place, and it's harder to see and process. If you're seeing through a blurry lens, you're not going to be able to make it out. And I think that those are the two main obstacles, and that creates the obstacle to genuine, respectful dialogue. And I've had friends who have encouraged me, hey, don't get hung up on the phrase. And there may be some on the panels, I don't know, who might agree or disagree with this, but don't get hung up on the phrase white privilege. If you can find alternative, equally faithful ways of explaining it and talking about it, then go for it. Find ways to break through, to have the dialogue, to bring people to the table, to engage in the conversation. And so that was kind of the why of the challenges that I face here in this area and in other places. And so yeah, you had mentioned about articulating it, and I think in brief, I think there are a couple of things that have been helpful. Assuming the person is open to the conversation at all, that's a key point. And these are not necessarily in any particular order, but asking empathetic and open-ended questions to my neighbors. How, like, for example, how have you understood the concept of white privilege? What emotions surface when you think about the idea? What areas do you think I'm missing when we're talking about it? And so this gives me a point of entry to where they are with the conversation. And when I'm figuring out where they are, I can more contextualize, I feel like, and kind of step into their space a little bit. And so It's one thing. The other thing is establishing that there's such a thing as privilege. In a lot of spheres, that in a lot of my friend circles, the idea of privilege, you can give all the examples all day long, but for them, they want to know that it's something that actually exists, because, as it's been stated here, it's often invisible. And so the idea of, well, if I can't see it, then it must not exist, and that's problematic. I mean, so establishing that privilege exists, period. And so I've got a friend in higher education who often talks about, we were having this conversation the other day, and he was saying that this, in certain institutions, and many institutions, if you are a child of an alumni, that gives you an upper hand against others trying to get into particular institutions. And doesn't mean you don't have to work hard for your GPA. That doesn't mean you don't have to strive to get there. But ultimately, if you have alumni privilege, then it's bent in your favor. It's more easily accessed. And so finding ways to prove that privilege exists in other spheres and then importing it into this conversation has been helpful. It makes it transferable. Sharing stories and examples. I think in these conversations, again, in my context, we like to shout numbers and facts, and but those go back and forth, and then we begin to interpret and put narratives to those numbers that, again, throw up walls. But I think stories are concrete. They're real. They're personal. They give evidence of an experienced reality. And when you hear stories that are similar over and over and over again, at some point you have to give weight and credibility to it. When you're hearing these stories, it's impossible not to give weight to it. Mm-hmm. And so this makes it human and real. And lastly, what's been effective in articulating it has just been encouraging them to move from awareness of privilege to the place of proximity, as Brian Stevenson would say. He says a lot of this is a proximity issue. A lot of this is not going to be solved by going to Google and trying to figure this out. We've got to get beyond our awareness into a place of where we're actually sitting with people, hearing stories, but being intentionally present with others, because we best learn from others when we're with them. And so I think those have been ways I've been trying to encourage folks to step into the conversation and to make some sense of things.
Thank you, Cody. Cliff knows well a story where someone who's a fellow pastor, someone who's an engineer, the same kind of engineering background as Cliff, when he heard some of Cliff's stories and they had a friendship, that opened his eyes. It wasn't the statistics, it wasn't the Google search, it was the relationship and the ongoing sustained relationship that really started opening his eyes. So I think that is so key. Cooky and Gloria go way back, long-standing friendship. And I know that Gloria's influence on Cooky and Bob, Cooky's husband, is huge. And it's the relationship. It's not just statistics, it's stories and shared life. So that being said, Ross, you've mentioned to me the image of an escalator. You just said this to me recently, an escalator. And what does the metaphor of escalator have to do with white privilege, Ross?
Yeah, so I need to give credit to Beverly Daniel Tatum for coming up with this illustration. My wife always says, hashtag a black woman already said that, and I don't want to take this as my idea. So, but she talks about in Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Other Conversations About Race, that book, which is a great starting point for a white person trying to come to grips with white privilege. She talks about white privilege as kind of like the moving escalator walkway at an airport, that it's moving, and similar to what Cody was saying, that what white privilege is not always blatant racism. It's just standing on that escalator that's always moving. So if you are doing racist things, then you're walking with that escalator. You're moving in the same direction, even helping propel it. But if you're just doing nothing, if you're just living life normally, there's 400 years of momentum and freight and history that is driving a directional force that gives you an advantage. And just standing still, you are in motion. And that was really helpful for me to grasp kind of the idea that it's this structural, bigger thing. And then to even go beyond that, as we walk against that momentum, we're still, in a sense, standing in the same place. And even Tim Wise, in his book White Like Me, talks about, even in his anti-racist work, often it continues to perpetuate the struggle into white privilege when he goes on a flight and he sees a black person flying the plane, and he questions, is that person qualified to be flying this plane? He thinks that thought in his head, even as an anti-racist. And so even going deeper, when we're trying to walk against it, we're almost continuing to propel that motion. And so for me, white privilege is really a crisis to struggle with. And I think for a lot of white people, myself included, when you begin to grapple with it, you want to fix it. That's what we want to. We want to be done with it. We want it to be fixed, or you deflect it by, like Cody said, talking about, I had a hard youth and I grew up in poverty. We have all these mechanisms for dealing with it, but there's a sense that 400 years of freight are behind this, and it's going to take generations. And there's a sense of having to sit in it and live in it and find a way to exist in a better way, understanding that this is a reality and a configuration that shapes us.
Thank you, Ross. And I know you and Rachel, for example, are very tenacious on wrestling through this on a daily basis, living the question, so to speak. And you're concerned about that momentum. And I think you're concerned about, if you stop for 1 minute, the momentum, that escalator that you're on, so to speak, is going to you have to keep walking the other way. You had to keep walking the other way at the airport or what have you, right? I mean, I think that's the key, because the momentum will just take you with it. And I think with these powerful protests, the nonviolent civil disobedience, where that's occurring, that nonviolent civil disobedience bound up with George Floyd's killing, the fear is that the momentum will come to an end. People will think that we've done it, we've conquered it, and then we're stopping, and that escalator is going to keep taking us along, right? I think that's the concern. Some really great things happening right now in terms of protest and changing systems, structures, but one cannot let up. I think it was Frederick Douglass who said, agitate, 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 to the young abolitionist. Agitate, agitate, agitate. And he pushed Lincoln big time. Agitate, agitate, agitate. And their relationship was also key. So thank you, Ross. Appreciate that very much. Cooky, as a white woman, you face the challenge of not being taken seriously in many contexts because you're a woman, because you're a white woman, what have you. So how might, as a white woman, you have privilege? I mean, it's hard enough to deal with these issues just when you face it from the opposite end. But I know some would say it's easy for white women to just go with the flow because it's one area where they might have a little bit of privilege. And how do you deal with that? Because you're very tenacious about these matters, but what does that look like for you? And how might you as a white woman have any privilege whatsoever?
It's you're right when you talk about even being a white woman and not taken seriously. As a white woman, I have experienced oppression and abuse at the hands of white men, the best of them. And as I look at myself as a white woman, though, I don't wake up every morning wondering, how is my skin color going to be a liability to me today? Am I going to be? I'm not worried as a white woman that if I get pulled over by the police, this is a life and death situation. Trauma that you live with every single day that just doesn't go away because of how I am treated. I do know that even as a white woman, I don't worry about Robert going out at night and whether he's going to come home because he fit the description. I'm not worried about my teenage grandson, that he wants to wear a hoodie and be cool I'm not worried about him going out like that and whether he is going to be a target. I'm not worried. I'm not worried about whether my children are having an equal opportunity at education. I'm not worried that that even in this COVID-19 set of circumstances and how the educational system had to go online. You know, my kids have a computer, my grandkids have a computer. Are they going to be able, or that they're not going to be able to participate? Whatever is thrown out them, you know, chances are they're going to get to participate. So there's a lot of things I don't have to worry about. On the other hand, where I do have a voice, the question is, am I going to use that voice? You know, and this voice, it's real easy, you know, as Ross was using the moving escalator set of circumstances, vigilance and intentionality is something that I can't let go of. In my sphere, and how in my sphere is in the church environment at this point in time, and for the last several years, you know, Frederick Douglass and the agitate, for whatever reason, God has given me an ability to agitate, where it comes back. It's more of a prophetic voice, you know, and it comes back. Okay, Cooky, you were saying what? Because I can say, you know, when I look at this, you know, like at the beginning, being able to say that, you know, white privilege is this belief that knowledge is white, you know, and an intentionality of being in relationship, not in my white bubble, but doing life with someone like Gloria, or having the opportunity to learn from Cliff and Gloria and so many of the books and authors that I read, even, you know, my opportunity to live in the context of Native America, those voices are very, very different for me. And so I can hear somebody say something to me in the context even of the church and be able to say, well, you know, if this were my friend Gloria, or in the African American context, that this is the only voice that's being heard here. Where's the other voice? You know, this is not going to be appropriate, or you know, various ways that you get to articulate. And then this is years. This is not one conversation. You know, it takes years for someone to maybe come back and say, remember what you were saying, you know, a couple of years ago when you said blank, can you unpack that for me a little bit more, you know? And I'm surprised often that it doesn't get to be unpacked right now, but that comes back and says, will you unpack it a little more? And then there's a willingness for a little bit more. And then there's an opportunity for some dialogue, and even bringing in other voices, so that it's not just, it's not me telling you, you know, it's the opportunity to begin to be in relationship with people of color that will, I think that there's such a, I look at my relationship with Gloria, and I think that that's key, because, or even my relationship with Cliff, or any of the people that love me, that are, you know, people of color that have put up with me over, you know, a million years of trying to learn and be open, because there is a willingness to even help me see in a different way. If it's just my voice, it's, you know, there's that white voice again that gets to be all knowledge. You know, it's a willingness to be able to hear that other voice and be in relationship with that other voice, those other voices, those stories, and be able to receive them in the depth of my being. Because the reality is, you know, we're all born into an already existing story, and we're talking existing stories here from 400 years on.
Mm-hmm. So true.
Hope
So
that
true.
makes sense.
Yeah, so true, Cooky. And two things just that I wish to highlight. Attentiveness. We find in 1 Peter 3:15 in very different contexts, always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that's within you, and always do so in gentleness and respect. It's talking about the gospel, and I reflect on that verse a lot in terms of gospel witness. I think similarly, I think you're one who's always seeking to be attentive. Is this an opportunity? Is this an opportunity? Is this an opportunity for me to share? And often when you're talking about these things, even now, as you were talking, back to Cody's point about stories, not simply statistics. Statistics matter, but stories, now that carries weight. How often does your relationship with Gloria or your relationship with Cliff shape how you're thinking about something? And if we don't have those relationships, we're like echo chambers. And we're just regurgitating. I see this all the time on Facebook, just regurgitating because we don't have conversations with people outside of our gamut. And to be stretched, all of us, myself included, in a variety of ways. But I think that the voices, not voices, your own voices playing in the head, but other friendships, relationships, people sharing their story. And you think about that. How would Gloria think about this? How would Cliff think about this? Probably very different from how this person's shaping the narrative right now. And I think that's key. And that's going to take us right now to Gloria and Cliff. Gloria and Cliff, you've been hearing a lot from our white friends. And one reason why I wanted to start out with some of our white friends sharing about these things is that so often in my circles, if an African-American says something, or even if they don't say something, white people, well-intentioned white people, we're not talking about bad intentions here at every turn, but will actually demand from African-Americans, okay, you prove it to me, type of thing. I think that's just so unfair because it's like you have to be the victim. And again, I'm not playing you play the victim, but it's easy in the structures of racism to victimize others. Then we blame the victim and say, now you have to prove it all to me. And I just see that happening a lot of times. And I wanted white friends to share their own experiences, their own reflections. But I also want to hear from you because it's like, I'm blind. I'm blind on these things. And I need good African-American friends and Asian-American friends and other friends to tell me, Paul, you're a bit skewed from my vantage point on this. Or let me compliment and add to that statement that was made by Ross, or what have you. So Gloria, your thoughts on what you've heard, what you'd wish to share for our viewers on what more is needed, what needs to be added to hone this conversation on white privilege. And then Cliff.
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate being invited to be a part of this conversation, and it's been enlightening. One of the things, walking down this path of 30 plus years with Cooky, we've experienced a lot over those years and unpacked it a lot. We both worked for, including her husband, worked for a affluent community in which minorities were a minority in that community in the city of Palo Alto. And I can think of a number of examples of, for instance, I was one of the 4 top appointed officers in that organization. And I can't tell you how many times when I said to someone of the white descent that I worked for the city of Palo Alto, and they would say to me, "You mean East Palo Alto?" And I have to say, "No, I know what side of the freeway I get on to go to work." So, it's just simple kinds of things like that. And picking up on what Cody said about awareness, I think it is absolutely critical. And right now, everyone in probably the world, especially the United States, is aware of what happened to George Floyd. So awareness is a major issue, and it's the first step in recognizing that there is this racism. There is this problem in the world that is actually taking a hold of us. And what we need to do is to be able to move from that awareness to action, to move from that of being knowledgeable and recognize that there is a need, as using what Ross said about the escalator is exactly that. It's the movement, it's the shifting. Paul, you may recall, and I looked back at our notes from 2010 when I was first invited to Oregon to be a part of a prayer summit. Cliff, you were invited, and Cooky and Bob, and there were several other of us that looked at that situation around Aaron Campbell, who had died. and the unfortunate situation with his death, and what could we do to make it different? What could we possibly do at this prayer summit, coming together with both Black and white people, discussing this particular crime and wanting to leave something that would move forward. And just like this, my concern is that where does this continue? How do we continue the momentum? Because I don't know what happened after that summit. I don't know whether the changes that we had recommended, the package that we had put together, was something that actually went into motion. What I hope and what I pray for is that what we are experiencing and the conversations and the relationships that are happening and the stories that are being shared, we've had 400 years of stories. Will that then be something that dies in 6 to 8 months and we be back again when something else emerges? My concern is that we need to be moving to a place where our attitudes are changing. Relationships are building where attitudes are changing in terms of how African Americans are perceived. I have a brother and a sister who are both public safety people, and I worry about them every time they walk out in their uniform. One of the things that I say to them is, the minute you take off that uniform and you're in a crowd, you're just like anyone else in that crowd that is African American. You face the same kinds of racism that anyone else is facing. The same thing with my son. So as Cooky said, I wake up every day worrying and praying for my family. It didn't start with George Floyd. It has been something that I've been doing since I was young, with my mother prayed. So, we're constantly aware of the fact that we need to be in a united front. We need to have the relationships that Cooky and I have built. That needs to be built across the spectrum, so that where we are now is not something that we have to relive again and again.
And thank you, Gloria. And I take to heart your point about where will we be in 8 months? Where will we be in 8 weeks on this subject? And we may be at a tipping point. Why now? And as I was talking to an African American this week, he said, George Floyd was next up. And he said, you know what? I might be next up after him. There's an African American pastor in town. I thought that was so apt what he said as far as why this occurred and the kind of response now. And it might be at a tipping point with the number of people, but we don't know. And often when these things occur, there can be a regression. People can get nauseated, they get weary. I've done my part, and we're kind of weak because we haven't strengthened that muscle of compassion, of resilience, to the point where we join in and we can't pull out. We cannot pull out. And I think that's an ongoing question for myself. I think it's an ongoing question for my friends here who are Caucasian as well. And we need to hear your voice, Gloria. Always need to hear your voice, and Cliff's as well. Cliff, your thoughts about what you've heard?
Yeah, this is the conversation that is so needed in our nation today, and basically around the world, but especially in our nation. And as I mentioned earlier, white privilege basically is a path to freedom for white people. And that's the freedom to do what they want to do, to think the way they want to think, to live where they want to live. I mean, it's just a free pass. And, in thinking about that, it's not that a person is racist, but they're given that free pass from birth. And by giving it from birth, it's a normal thing. And when you point out that you have white privilege, well, they have the freedom to say, no, I don't. Even though they do, the freedom is there for them to deny. The challenge is to have them see that they have white privilege, that they have this privilege, and to acknowledge that and to turn that around. As far as for me as a Black person, like I said, I have to earn it. And oftentimes I still, no matter how hard I try, I still cannot earn that privilege. You know, whether I'm an educated Black man, I have money as a Black man, I'm a pastor, I'm an engineer, all of these things, you know. And I was thinking about yesterday, I was driving down the street, and in the lane, I was in the left lane, and the lane to my right was a police officer. My first thought was, will he look over and see me as a Black man and pull me over? And my mind began to go, if he did pull me over, how will it go? That is a question that I think about every time I see a police officer, because I've had too many experiences where that has happened, where they see that I'm a Black man and I get pulled over for some crazy reason. And I thought about it. I just want to show you this example. You all see my face right now. You recognize me. You know who I am. But for a person who don't know me, if they saw that part of me, what would they think? It doesn't matter if I'm educated. It doesn't matter if I'm an engineer. It doesn't matter if I'm a pastor. Like Gloria said, once her family members, they take the uniform off, they go out to the street. This is what others see. They see the Blackness, they see the skin. That automatically says that for me to do what I need to do, I have to prove it. Whereas a white person with privilege, you get a free pass. And Paul, you mentioned this friend of mine. You know, he's an engineer, I'm an engineer. He's a pastor, I'm a pastor. We went basically to the same school. I mean, and the one thing that we got into a discussion, and relationships are so key, because if a white people oftentimes have these conversations among themselves, basically they're regurgitating and reinforcing their white privilege and reinforcing their definition of what that is. But when they have a conversation with a Black person, and the Black person brings a different perspective, now there's the challenge whether I'm going to maintain my white privilege and my definition, because I have the privilege, because a white person has the privilege of naming what it is, or am I going to allow this Black person to interject their definition of what it is, and as a white person accept that? And this friend of mine, by us having a relationship, he really wanted a concrete definition of racism. And the definitions that were given really went against what he perceived and what he had named as through his white privilege. And what happened with that, as he was pushing for a definition, he got a definition, but it was not in the form of words. It was in the form of an experience. And when he had the experience, it really shook up his world. And he was very disturbed by that. But when I came back to him and I began to share with him, I said, you know, this is what I experience all the time. This is what you experience is what I experience. So you really got your answer. You got the definition that you were looking for. It just did not come in the form that you were looking for. And that changed his perception of racism, and as well as his white privilege. But the beauty of that, and we talk about white privilege, and I think Cody mentioned that oftentimes when people hear that, they think of the negative connotation. But white privilege can be also a positive thing for people who have, when you experience and have those relationships between blacks and whites, and you begin to understand white privilege through a relationship. Now what happens, you can take that understanding and that knowledge that you've gained and use your white privilege and help your other white cohorts understand what white privilege is and what racism is. And so white privilege, when you hear it, don't just let it be a negative, turn it around for something positive as well. And with what we are experiencing in this country right now, a lot of people are waking up, and it is my prayer that enough white people will experience what is happening and will see and will use their white privilege. Don't just let their white privilege cause them to withdraw, but cause them to engage and use their white privilege in a positive way to really bring about change, so that 6 months from now, we're not back in the same place that we are, but that we really have advanced and begin to break down this thing that's been established for 400 years.
Pastor Cliff, that's a great transition to the next steps in terms of this video cast. And so I'd like to do a part 2 on white privilege. Perhaps some of you, all of you, would be willing to join me for that, about positive steps forward to change direction on the escalator, if you will. What can we do? We're at the end of our time right now at New Wine Tastings, but I want to continue the conversation, to move forward on it. Where do we go from here? So Gloria, Cooky, Cliff, Ross, Cody, thank you so much for joining us at New Wine Tastings as we seek to understand white privilege, to ask open-ended questions, to live stories with friends who will speak into our lives, and then take it forward in such a way that we become part of the solution, so there's greater inclusion, moving forward in the right direction toward greater equity and justice in our society, so that truly Black lives matter, and if Black lives don't matter, no one's life matters. And I think we need to really account for this as we move forward and change, become part of the change that's needed. Thank you, friends, for joining us today. Blessings to you.